Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. We're here in Washington, D.C. at an event for Dr. Ben Carson, Carson's Scholars Fund. Of course, Dr. Carson is the Chief of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Carson, an honor and a privilege to talk with you.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right, so Dr. Carson, we're talking about your scholarship fund. Why, of course, do you work so hard on education issues?
Well, because the founders of our nation said that the viability of our nation will depend on having a well-informed and educated populace. And if we ever have something less than that, the nature of our country will change. And the reason it's so important is you have to have people who know enough to be able to analyze situations for themselves, don't simply have to be spoon-fed by the news media, which in many cases has its own agendas. So that is crucial. We live in a society now where, for instance, Congress has a 9% approval rating, and yet we return people to Congress at a rate of 90%, which means that when people go into the voting booth, they're just saying, ooh, that name looks familiar. Yeah, I'll vote for that one, without really knowing anything about the person, what their policies are, and whether it even agrees with your own philosophy. So, it's very important to bring that aspect back to the masses. And the other component of the Scholars Program is the humanitarian aspect. We have always been a very humanitarian country. We have always cared about others. When we were a much smaller nation, no one ever starved when we didn't have big federal programs because people took care of people in their own communities. I remember when I first started practicing medicine, most doctors, 10, 15% of their patients were indigent patients, didn't have any money. No problem, you just took care of them anyway. Because at that time the insurance companies had to pay for the ones that you did have, that did have insurance, so you just wrote the other ones off. But when there's a disaster anywhere in the world, we're the first people in line to help. This is something that we don't want to extinguish. We don't want to let all the class warfare and all the other kinds of divisions that are going on, the political divisions, cause people to stop being the same kind of helpful, generous people that they always have been. So that's why that part of the scholarship program exists.
Of course, you have a distinguished career as a doctor, a surgeon, and a lot of people heard your name for the first time after the prayer breakfast. But if you could put that aside, and you made some very common sense policy prescriptions for medicine, and people think that would solve the issue. But we also hear about medicine in this country is going to bankrupt us eventually. But if you could put that aside and look at education which do you think, we could say both are at a crisis point. Which do you think is more important to the future of this country?
Well, it's very difficult. That's a difficult question because they're both critical. Because if we bankrupt ourselves, there won't be a country. It's sort of like we have a ship that is about to sail off of Niagara Falls and everybody be killed. And there's a bunch of barnacles on the side. And people are saying, we need to get that barnacle off. No, let's get that one off. In the meantime, poof, over the cliff, it doesn't really matter anymore. And so those things that are about to lead us to that fiscal cliff need to be dealt with. And so in that sense, the economics of which healthcare is a huge portion needs to be dealt with in a logical fashion. It needs to be done soon. There is sort of this laissez-faire attitude, everything will be okay, we don't have to really do anything urgently. In the meantime, our debt is accumulating at such a rate, as I mentioned at the prayer breakfast, to even count to 16 trillion. One number per second would take you 507,000 years. I mean, it is such a staggering number. And all we have to do is begin to enact some policies that are business friendly. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that if you have the highest corporate tax rates in the world, you're not going to attract corporations. They're going to do things in other places. that shouldn't even be an issue that anybody has to think about. And yet, for us, it's a gigantic issue. And we talk about it, and everybody agrees that we need to deal with it, but nothing gets done. And that's part of the problem. We have all this gridlock. We have a lot of people who talk and pontificate in the process of trying to get people to like them and come over to their party. But in terms of actually doing anything, it's not happening.
And in terms of education, how far are we from going off that same type of cliff with our education policy in this country?
Well, we have two sets of people in education: those who are highly educated, who get the best of everything and do extraordinarily well, but that's a shrinking number. And then we have the masses. Our public schools used to be the envy of the world in the pre-1930 time. But remember, in those times, we spent a lot of emphasis on very basic education, and we also taught values in our school system. Since we started becoming politically correct, and basically there are no values, and since we've started integrating everything else into the curriculum and not making the basic things that a person needs to know, giving it primacy, we're suffering the consequences of that. We used to teach such basic things as home economics in school. And people knew, for instance, that you didn't buy a house that cost more than 2.5 times your annual salary. That knowledge was lost some time ago. And that was part of the reason that we had the housing crisis. That would have never happened 40 or 50 years ago. People would have laughed at you if you told them if they made $40,000 that they could buy a $400,000 house. They would have just laughed at you.
So in other words, the education system needs to get back to the basics.
Back to the basics, learn the basics. If we get back to the basics in education and we teach people to respect each other, even if they disagree about something, to respect each other, I think we will have taken a gigantic step toward getting back on the trajectory of success.
And in terms of making the system more competitive in school choice, where does that play into the education system?
Well, school choice obviously plays a huge role. And, I think, having charter schools, having school vouchers, things of that nature are extremely good, because unless you are competing for those students, it's very likely you're going to become complacent. Schools and teachers, educators are no different than anybody else. People tend to respond to stimulation. And when there's no stimulation, they tend to kind of relax. So we need to put the appropriate stimulation there to increase the competitive nature of education.
You also talked about the gotcha mentality of the baby boomer generation, is what you mentioned. And we certainly see that. You've been a victim of that in the media. It's pretty much universal. How do we get past that?
Well, again, if we teach our young people values, we used to teach people about lying, and yet we see lying rampant in our society today, particularly in the news media. They'll grab something, for instance, saying that I compare homosexuality to bestiality, which I've made very clear that there's no comparison. It doesn't matter whether I've made that very clear. And a lot of people didn't take it that way. Many homosexuals have contacted me and said, we didn't take it that way. But because of the narrative that they need to paint, they say, he compared it and he hates homosexuals, which is just total nonsense, total opposite of how I feel. And of course, if they read my book, which I'm sure they have, and it really spells out how I feel about the whole gay marriage issue, and it's very fair to homosexuals, and I'm sure they've read that, and the reason that they choose to ignore that is because it completely blows their argument out of the water.
You've been mentioned as a possible political candidate. All this attention and the negative publicity, does it turn you off, or does it make you want to play more of a bigger role in terms of policy?
Well, it has spurred me on, quite frankly, because I get so much mail, so many communication. Every place I go, It's unbelievable, the people who come up to me and say, oh, please keep speaking out. Please keep this up. Please don't let us down. We need you so badly. But it spurs me on, but in a way it saddens me because I recognize that there's so many people who just are afraid to speak up, and this is America. And how did we get to a point where people feel intimidated about expressing their feelings in a country that was based on freedom of speech and freedom of expression? We've fallen so far. We should be very alarmed about what's going on here.
It does seem to be headed in the wrong direction.
Absolutely.
When you consider your political aspirations, what's next for you? I mean,
well, you know, I will continue to speak out about common sense, things that are logical. I will continue to point out the fallacies of policies, and I will continue to challenge the media to try to be truthful, to try to be fair.
There's, you know, we also hear some things, you know, more from the right side of the media that about you know, you're a victim here, but this goes along with everything else. There's choice in the media, and that people can choose to get where the news from.
Well, I personally don't feel like a victim.
And my question, I guess, is it wrong to be portrayed as a victim? Do you get upset when say Ben Carson's being treated unfairly by the media?
Well, I expect it. I mean, that's why I speak up about political correctness and what's going on. I think you have to face it head on. If we don't, our country will become something that we all will dread. And eventually, even a lot of the media will wake up and recognize that if our country goes down that road, that they too will be victims.
Dr. Ben Carson, a pleasure to speak with you, and thanks for your insight.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.